Okay, so today I want to talk about something that I believe is one of the most important and most misunderstood realities in modern geopolitics. And once you truly understand this, suddenly everything else begins to make sense. The aircraft carriers, the naval bases, the South China Sea tension, Taiwan, the Philippines, the AI race, the economic war between Washington and Beijing, all of it connects to one narrow strip of water. And the terrifying thing for China is this. China's greatest vulnerability is not military weakness. It is not political instability. It is not even war itself. It is geography. More specifically, it is a narrow maritime corridor called the Strait of Malacca. And the reason this matters so much is because China's rise as a superpower depends on something incredibly fragile: flow. The flow of oil, the flow of trade, the flow of energy, the flow of semiconductors, the flow of industrial materials, the flow of food. China looks powerful on the surface, and in many ways it is. It has enormous industrial capacity, massive infrastructure, one of the largest navies in the world, advanced missile systems, AI development, satellite networks, global manufacturing dominance. But underneath all of that power sits one dangerous reality. China cannot survive economically without maritime trade. And most of that trade passes through choke points China does not fully control. This is the hidden structure of global power. Most people think power comes from military strength alone. Bigger armies, bigger navies, better missiles, better jets. But military power is only surface level power. Real power, structural power, comes from controlling systems, trade systems, energy systems, shipping systems, financial systems, supply chains, maritime corridors. And this is why the Strait of Malacca matters more than many military bases combined. Because the Strait of Malacca is not just a waterway. It is the artery of the Chinese economy. And every great empire in history has feared the same thing. Not invasion, interruption. Rome feared interruption of grain shipments. Britain feared disruption of maritime trade. Japan feared oil embargoes before World War II. Germany feared blockade pressure during both world wars. And now China fears the same thing. Because history teaches us something brutal. Industrial powers do not collapse only from military defeat. Sometimes they collapse because the systems feeding them slowly suffocate. And that is what makes the Strait of Malacca so dangerous for Beijing. Now, before we go deeper, I want to explain what the Strait of Malacca actually is and why it matters so much. Because many people hear the name, but they do not understand the numbers behind it. The Strait of Malacca is a narrow shipping lane located between Malaysia, Singapore, and Indonesia. At some points, it narrows to less than 2 miles wide for deep draft shipping traffic. Think about that for a second. One of the most important economic arteries on Earth narrows to an incredibly small corridor. And through this corridor passes roughly around 30% of global trade, nearly 60% of China's maritime commerce, approximately 80% of China's oil imports, massive LNG shipments, industrial raw materials, semiconductor-related supply chains. Every day, thousands of ships pass through this route. Oil tankers, container ships, LNG carriers, military vessels. The global economy flows through this corridor like blood through an artery. And China depends on it more than almost any other major power. This is why Chinese strategists have spent decades obsessing over something called the Malacca Dilemma. This phrase became famous after Chinese leadership openly expressed concern that foreign powers could potentially threaten China by controlling the Strait of Malacca. And the foreign power they feared most was obvious: the United States. Now, I want you to think carefully about what this means, because this is where most geopolitical analysis stops being superficial and starts becoming structural. America does not need to invade China to hurt China. America does not need troops marching toward Beijing. America does not even need direct war. The threat of interruption alone changes Chinese strategic behavior. This is the key concept. The threat itself is power, and this is why geography matters so much. The United States sits between two massive oceans with enormous natural resources and secure continental depth. China does not. China imports huge amounts of oil from the Middle East, Africa, Russia, Southeast Asia, and much of that energy must travel by sea, which means China's economy depends heavily on maritime vulnerability. And maritime vulnerability creates strategic pressure. This is why China has spent decades trying to solve this problem. Everything Beijing does in the Indo-Pacific connects back to this fear. The South China Sea militarization, artificial islands, naval expansion, the Belt and Road Initiative, ports in Pakistan, influence in Myanmar, rail corridors into Central Asia, energy pipelines, pressure on Taiwan. All of it connects to the same strategic anxiety. China is trying to escape geographic containment, and this is where the game becomes incredibly sophisticated. Because America understands this weakness perfectly. American military planners have understood for decades that China's economy is deeply dependent on maritime access. This is why America's alliance system forms what many strategists call the first island chain. Japan, Taiwan, the Philippines. Look at a map carefully. These positions create a strategic arc surrounding China's maritime access points. This is not accidental, it is structural positioning. And suddenly you begin to understand why the Philippines matter so much. Most people think the Philippines is just another regional ally. Wrong. The Philippines sits near some of the most important maritime routes on Earth. Military access in the Philippines allows the United States to project power into South China Sea, the Taiwan Strait surrounding maritime corridors. And from Beijing's perspective, this looks terrifying, because it means America can potentially monitor, and in extreme scenarios disrupt Chinese trade flows. Again, the threat itself changes strategic calculations. This is why China reacts aggressively to American military cooperation with Manila. It is not emotional, it is structural. China sees containment. Now let us go even deeper. Because the Strait of Malacca is not merely an oil route. It is actually three systems layered together. The first system is energy. China imports massive amounts of oil. Without energy, factories slow down, logistics weaken, transportation networks suffer, industrial production declines, and industrial production is the foundation of Chinese economic power. But the second system is even more important. Trade. China became a superpower through export manufacturing. Its economy is deeply connected to global supply chains. Chinese factories produce electronics machinery, industrial components, telecommunications equipment, solar technology, AI, hardware, consumer goods. And those products move through maritime shipping routes, which means disruption in maritime trade creates cascading economic effects. Factories weaken, exports decline, foreign investors panic, supply chains destabilize, currency pressure increases, economic confidence weakens. And modern economies depend heavily on confidence. This is something many people fail to understand. Markets are psychological systems as much as economic systems. Fear itself creates damage. And this is why strategic choke points are so powerful. Now the third system is the most underestimated of all. Semiconductors. Modern civilization runs on chips. AI systems, phones, cars, military hardware, satellites, financial infrastructure. Everything depends on semiconductors, and East Asia dominates semiconductor manufacturing and shipping infrastructure, which means Indo-Pacific maritime security directly affects the global technology economy. This is why Taiwan matters so much. Taiwan is not just territory. Taiwan is infrastructure, technological infrastructure, economic infrastructure, strategic infrastructure. And if you connect Taiwan to the Strait of Malacca and connect both to American naval power, suddenly the entire Indo-Pacific competition starts making sense. This is not random tension. This is systemic competition over the architecture of global trade. Now, I want to introduce another critical concept, insurance. Because most people imagine maritime disruption like a Hollywood movie, missiles exploding, ships sinking, massive naval battles. But economic warfare often works quietly. If shipping companies believe a route is dangerous, insurance premiums rise, banks hesitate, shipping costs increase, investors panic. Even if no official blockade exists, this is critical. A route does not need to be physically closed to become economically damaged. The perception of danger alone changes behavior, and China understands this deeply. Because China's greatest fear is not merely military encirclement, it is economic strangulation, slow pressure, structural pressure, the kind of pressure that weakens economies over time. And history shows us repeatedly that prolonged economic stress can destabilize even powerful nations. The Soviet Union weakened economically before political collapse. Imperial Japan faced severe oil pressure before Pearl Harbor. Germany suffered heavily under blockade systems. Economic systems become fragile when external flows are threatened, and China's flows are extraordinarily vulnerable. Now here's where things become even more interesting. China has not ignored this problem. In fact, Beijing has spent years trying to build alternatives. This is where the Belt and Road Initiative becomes extremely important. Most people think Belt and Road is simply infrastructure diplomacy, roads, railways, ports, but structurally it is much bigger than that. It is China attempting to redesign geography itself. Pipelines through Central Asia reduce maritime dependence. Ports in Pakistan create alternate access routes. Rail links into Europe diversify trade corridors. Investments in Myanmar provide Indian Ocean access. China is attempting to create redundancy because redundancy is survival. No major power wants dependence on a single vulnerable artery. And yet, despite all these efforts, the Strait of Malacca remains central. This is the terrifying reality for Beijing. Even after years of infrastructure expansion, China still depends heavily on maritime trade routes vulnerable to geopolitical pressure. And this creates a strategic paradox. China is rising economically, but its rise creates greater dependence on external flows, which increases vulnerability. The more China grows, the more energy it needs, the more shipping it needs, the more imports it needs, the more exports it needs. Growth itself deepens exposure. This is the hidden contradiction at the center of China's superpower ambitions, and this contradiction is shaping the future of the 21st century. Because America understands something fundamental. If you cannot stop a rival economically, you shape the environment around its flows. You shape trade routes, alliance systems, technology restrictions, maritime security architecture. This is why the Indo-Pacific has become the center of global strategy, because this is where the future balance of global power will be decided. And at the center of that balance sits one narrow corridor of water, the Strait of Malacca. This is not just geography. This is structural power. And the terrifying thing for Beijing is this. The weapon does not even need to be fully used. The threat alone is enough to reshape strategic calculations across the entire Indo-Pacific region. The most powerful wars are sometimes fought without missiles. Okay, now I want to take this analysis much deeper, because once you understand the Strait of Malacca, you begin to understand something even bigger. Modern superpowers are no longer held together only by military strength. They are held together by systems, energy systems, trade systems, financial systems, technology systems, financial systems, information systems, and the terrifying thing about systems is this: you do not always need to destroy them directly. Sometimes you only need to interrupt them. This is the core idea behind what many strategists call structural warfare. Structural warfare is different from traditional warfare. Traditional warfare destroys armies. Structural warfare pressures the systems that armies depend on. And in the 21st century, structural pressure can become more dangerous than bombs. Because modern economies are extremely interconnected. Factories depend on global shipping. Markets depend on investor confidence. Technology depends on supply chains. Energy depends on maritime access. Currencies depend on economic stability. Everything is connected, and this is why the Strait of Malacca matters so much. Because it is not merely a shipping route. It is a pressure point inside the structure of globalization itself. Now I want you to think carefully about how vulnerable modern civilization really is. Most people imagine superpowers as giant self-sufficient machines, but they are not. Modern superpowers are networks, and networks are fragile. A disruption in one area creates cascading effects everywhere else. This is why small disruptions sometimes create enormous consequences. A shipping delay in Asia affects factories in Europe. A semiconductor shortage affects car production in America. Oil disruptions affect food prices globally. The world economy operates like a nervous system, and the Strait of Malacca is one of its most sensitive nerves. Now let us talk specifically about China. China's economic rise was built on globalization, cheap manufacturing, global exports, industrial scale, maritime commerce. China became the factory of the world because global trade systems allowed Chinese goods to move efficiently across oceans. But this created a hidden vulnerability: dependence. China became dependent on the very systems that made it powerful. This is the paradox of globalization. Integration creates strength, but integration also creates exposure. And the more successful China became, the more dependent it became on uninterrupted maritime trade. This is why Beijing fears instability in the Indo-Pacific more than almost anything else. Because instability threatens flow, and flow is survival. Now here is where the analysis becomes extremely important. Many people think America's greatest weapon against China is military superiority. I disagree. America's greatest weapon is system influence. The United States sits at the center of global finance, maritime security, reserve currency systems, advanced technology, networks, alliance structures. This creates enormous structural leverage, and China knows this. This is why Beijing is trying to build parallel systems, alternative banking systems, alternative trade corridors, alternative technology ecosystems, alternative energy routes. China is trying to reduce dependence on American-controlled structures, because dependence creates vulnerability. Now let us connect this back to the Strait of Malacca. Imagine a major geopolitical crisis in the Indo-Pacific. Not necessarily full war, just tension, naval deployments, military exercises, regional confrontation, insurance panic, shipping uncertainty. What happens? Oil prices rise, shipping costs increase, investors become nervous, supply chains slow down, manufacturing confidence weakens, even before a single missile is fired. This is critical. The perception of danger alone can create economic consequences, and this is why modern structural warfare is so powerful. The goal is not always destruction. Sometimes the goal is pressure, persistent pressure, economic pressure, psychological pressure, strategic pressure, and pressure changes political behavior. Now let us discuss something extremely important, energy, because energy is the foundation of industrial civilization. Without energy, factories stop, transportation weakens, logistics fail, economies slow down. China consumes enormous amounts of energy. It is one of the largest energy importers on Earth. And much of that energy travels through vulnerable maritime corridors. This creates what strategists call strategic dependence. China's industrial machine depends on external energy flows, and external energy flows create strategic risk. Now compare this to the United States. America has enormous domestic energy production, shale oil. Now, this gives America greater resilience during global disruptions. China does not have the same level of energy insulation, which means maritime insecurity affects Beijing differently. And this explains why China has invested so aggressively in pipeline networks, Central Asian energy routes, Russian energy partnerships, Middle Eastern relationships, naval modernization. China's trying to reduce strategic exposure, but the problem is geography. Geography cannot be changed easily, and geography still favors American maritime power. This is one of the deepest realities of modern geopolitics. The United States became a global superpower partly because geography protected it. Two massive oceans, secure neighbors, internal rivers, natural resources. China faces a much more difficult environment, crowded maritime zones, regional rivals, vulnerable trade corridors, dependence on imported energy, and this creates permanent strategic anxiety in Beijing. Now I want to talk about something most people completely underestimate: time. Because modern competition between America and China is not only about military strength, it is about endurance. Which system can survive pressure longer? Which economy can absorb disruption better? Which political system can maintain stability under stress? These questions matter enormously because great power competition is often a long game, and long games favor resilience. Now here is where the Strait of Malacca becomes terrifying from China's perspective. It creates asymmetric vulnerability. The United States can pressure China's maritime flows more easily than China can pressure America's continental survival. This imbalance matters because strategic imbalance affects negotiation power, and Beijing understands this perfectly. This is why China increasingly talks about self-reliance, domestic technology, internal consumption, industrial independence. China is trying to reduce systemic vulnerability before a future crisis emerges, because Chinese leadership understands something crucial. A nation dependent on external systems can be pressured through those systems. Now I want to discuss Taiwan because Taiwan connects directly to this entire strategic architecture. Most people think Taiwan matters only because of politics or ideology. That is superficial analysis. Taiwan matters because it sits inside the geography of maritime control, and Taiwan also dominates semiconductor production. This creates a fusion between military geography, technological infrastructure, economic systems, which makes Taiwan one of the most strategically important locations on Earth. Now imagine a crisis around Taiwan. Immediately, shipping risk increases, insurance prices surge, markets panic, semiconductor supply chains destabilize, global manufacturing slows. Again, modern war is not isolated anymore. Everything is connected. This is why the Indo-Pacific matters more than many people realize. It is not simply a regional rivalry, it is the center of the global economic system. And whoever shapes this region shapes the future structure of global power. Now let us go even deeper into something many analysts avoid discussing openly: psychological warfare. Because structural pressure is also psychological. If businesses believe instability is coming, investment slows, capital moves, manufacturing plans change, strategic calculations shift, fear itself becomes an economic force. And this is why credibility matters. The ability to create believable threat scenarios creates leverage. America's naval presence creates credibility. China's military expansion creates counter-credibility. Both sides are trying to shape perception because perception shapes markets and markets shape power. This is the hidden battlefield beneath modern geopolitics. Now let me explain something extremely important about naval power. Naval power is not merely about fighting wars. Naval power is about controlling movement, trade movement, energy movement, resource movement. Historically, maritime empires dominated global systems because they controlled routes. The British Empire understood this perfectly. The United States inherited much of this maritime logic after World War II. America's Navy became the guarantor of global maritime trade, and global trade became structured around American naval security. China rose economically inside a system largely protected by American maritime dominance. This is one of the great ironies of modern history. The system that enabled China's rise is also the system China fears dependence on. And Beijing knows this dependency creates strategic vulnerability. Now here is the terrifying part. The world economy today is far more interconnected than during previous eras, which means disruptions spread faster. A crisis in one maritime corridor can ripple through energy markets, stock markets, food systems, manufacturing systems, technology sectors. This interconnectedness creates enormous fragility, and fragility creates leverage, which is why strategic choke points are becoming more important in modern geopolitics. Now I want to introduce another concept, economic gravity. China became powerful because global manufacturing shifted toward Asia. Factories concentrated there, shipping concentrated there, supply chains concentrated there. This created massive economic gravity around East Asia. But gravity creates dependency. The world became dependent on Asian manufacturing, and Asian manufacturing became dependent on maritime stability, which means maritime instability now threatens the entire global economy. This is why even small Indo-Pacific tensions scare markets. Investors understand how interconnected everything has become. And this brings us back to the central reality of this entire analysis. The Strait of Malacca is not simply a waterway. It is structural leverage. It is one of the most important pressure points in the architecture of globalization. And this is why Beijing fears it so deeply. Because if a nation's economy depends on uninterrupted flow, then the threat against that flow becomes a strategic weapon. Even without war, even without missiles, even without invasion, the possibility alone changes behavior. And in modern geopolitics, the ability to shape behavior is often more powerful than the ability to destroy.